The war at home continued. Canadians were generally in support of the war, but when a war lasts 4 years, how did the government get Canadians to maintain their support? The answer was propaganda. Think of advertisements, commercials, and print ads make you want to buy the latest iPhone. A way of spreading ideas or information, they persuaded people to support the war. The posters were also made to get men to enlist. Let's look at this poster. Why don't I go? Posters made men feel like going to war was the right thing. These posters were especially important as soldiers died and needed to be replaced. They also gathered support for Canadians to save food and materials, buy victory bonds, and help with wartime causes. This meant Canadians should save resources to send overseas. But how did it work? Think about how the poster makes you feel. The government used this little girl to make men feel that if they couldn't go to war, they had to at least buy a bond. If they didn't, they'd be breaking their daughters' hearts. These posters and billboards were everywhere. They ranged from making people save food to enlist and even give money to buy cigarettes for soldiers. The government pulled on Canadians' nationalist heartstrings to get what they wanted. The major use of propaganda was conscription. Conscription is when all able-bodied men are forced to enlist in the army. This was introduced by Robert Borden, Canada's Prime Minister during the war. Our conscription timeline. In 1914, war began with excitement, and Canada had more volunteers than it needed. Men were being turned away. Borden promised Canadians there would be no conscription. In 1916, however, Borden had promised Britain 500,000 recruits by the end of the year, but he only had 300,000. The number of men enlisting was dropping. News from the trenches was reaching home, and this meant fewer volunteers. Also, war industries like weapon making created high-paying jobs. Many farmers did not enlist because they were warned about what would happen to their farms when they got back. French Canadians had no loyalty to Britain and so felt no need to go to war. In 1917, Borden went back on his promise and introduced conscription. With the election approaching, this made conscription the main issue. However, Robert Borden still won the 1917 election. How did he win is a good question. So, let's recap. With the number of bodies increasing, men were needed to replace them. But the number of men volunteering to go was decreasing. Borden was under a lot of pressure from Europe to deliver more soldiers. So he introduced the Military Service Act, but with an election coming up, he needed to gather support. Before the election, Borden introduced the Military Voters Act, which allowed soldiers to vote, and the Wartime Elections Act, which allowed women the right to vote if they had male relatives serving overseas. With this support, he was able to win and pass the Military Service Act. This introduced conscription in 1918. Over 400,000 men across Canada were ordered to go to war. Some asked to be excused and others went into hiding. By the end of the war, only 24,000 soldiers were forced to conscript. What did this do to English and French relations? Henry Bourassa, the leader of Quebec, was at odds with Robert Borden. The introduction of conscription divided English and French-speaking Canadians. French Canada thought they could be removed from the war because of Borden's promise. The army was 100% English-speaking. French at the time was not a recognized language. This created many obstacles for French Canadian. When conscription passed, riots broke out in Montreal. Conscription meant that every man was required to fill out a registration form. Many French Canadians refused. French Canadians protested conscription, and when riots broke out in Montreal, store windows were smashed and policemen were called to control the crowds. But what did this mean for Canada? French and English Canadians started to hate and distrust each other. French Canadians were a minority. They thought English Canadians were not respecting them. French Canadians felt isolated from Canada, and they were nationalists who thought conscription was unnecessary.